Good evening, one and all. Hello, all you lovely people, and welcome to the Arboricultural Association's Wednesday webinar, sponsored by Still. My name is John Parker, CEO at the Association and your host for this evening. Please do say hello in the chat, as many of you already have. Let us know where you're watching from. Make sure you select everyone before you put that message in. This evening is our 80th Wednesday webinar. 80, imagine that. And what better way to celebrate than to listen to Russell and Jim considering why we lose so many trees, and is decay detection being discredited by poorly executed tests and poorly interpreted results. We'll get onto that in just a moment, but as ever, I'd like to tell you about what we have coming up as well. It's almost the end of the series. Ooh. But fear not, next week we're going to be joined by three wonderful speakers delivering two wonderful presentations. Carrie Brady and Helen Kyle will be putting Tilia in the spotlight and talking about some of the pests and diseases we might want to be looking out for on our precious lime trees or linden trees, depending on where you are in the world. Also in that webinar, we welcome Asher Pedersen, who will be presenting the Wild Streets Project, an engagement and visualization tool for the design and planning of green urban spaces. So that one is not to be missed. The following week, February the 21st, I'm very excited to welcome Levon Bigelow, Research Fellow with the Oak Ridge Institute for Sciences and Education, who will be presenting his work looking at the composition and survival of street trees in Philadelphia. It's a really great project from a really great speaker, so I hope to see you there for that one as well. There will be a second speaker for that webinar too, but I'm just waiting back to hear from them to see if they're able to do it. So, exciting. Watch this space, but I just get on and register anyway, absolutely free of charge right now. Earlier on today, I was finishing writing some of my articles for the next Arb magazine because I'm a little bit tardy with my copy dates. And I was going to tell you all right now to look out for it because it's the first of our 60th anniversary celebration editions. And then I remembered that some of you wouldn't receive this incredible publication because you're not members of the association. So I thought I'd take this opportunity to just do a little poll, if you'll indulge me for a minute. And I just wanted to ask you a simple question, which Andrew's going to put on the screen any second now, I believe. And there we are. That question is, are you a member of the Arboricultural Association? And it's just a simple yes or no question. Don't panic, there's no pressure. We're not taking names. Or are we? No, we're not taking names. It's just for my own gratification. If you're not a member and you'd like to be one and help support all of the work we do, including these webinars, and of course that would be marvellous. Importantly, if you're a student and if you're studying arboriculture or a related field anywhere in the world, then you're entitled to free student membership. So please do take a look on the website for more information about that. What have we got? Yes, 56%. No, 44%. That's not too bad. Well done, everybody. Thank you. Well, that's very nice to see lots of members. And of course, welcome to people who aren't members yet. That's the way I'm going to choose to look at it. We've got members and people who haven't yet become members, but you are all just as special to me, of course. So use the chat to have some polite, friendly discussion. Keep it clean, folks. Select everyone when you do. Switch on the closed captions if that would be of use to you. Submit your questions using the Q&A button. Get your emoji clicking fingers ready because now it's time to get down to business with our speakers this evening. And first up, it's Russell. Over to you.
Thanks, John. Thank you to the Arb Association, John and Andrew, for hosting, and for Jim for joining us this evening. This should be good fun. I am an arboricultural consultant and an ecologist and former human rights lawyer, the relevance of which may prove significant when I start talking about the law. So I'm just going to share my screen and hopefully you can see my presentation. Why do we lose so many trees? Essentially, I'm going to be talking about the primary issues as I see it for us losing trees and really trying to kind of encourage people maybe to think slightly differently about some of the key issues which cause us to lose trees. Then Jim's going to come in and he's going to talk about decay detection and tomography in a bit more detail. I'm going to be kind of looking at an overview. So, how many trees are we losing? This data is quite tricky. There's not absolutely clear data in the UK, but I got this through the internet. Roughly 60 street and park trees being lost per day. certainly in the period 2010 to 2017, according to Freedom of Information requests to local councils. I think some of the councils probably didn't have the data to reply to that, so it may be even higher than that. And on that data from 2010 to 2017, only 113,000 of the 150,000 had been replaced. So, that's a pretty worrying decline in actual numbers. And I dare say many of you will know that even those trees that are replaced will not necessarily get to the size or the maturity of the trees we're losing, because the average life expectancy for a street tree, generally speaking, is about 20 years. And obviously, certainly in London and some of the older cities, we've got London planes and lime trees, which are well over a century old. So if we're losing century or 50-year-old trees and not replacing them all, and the ones we are replacing are only lasting 20 years, we have a big problem. In addition to that, it is the big old trees which do all the ecosystem services. Young trees are good, but old trees, big trees are better. That data excludes losses in the countryside and in forestry. So what's going on? Economics, culture, law, all of these things play a part. Profit drives development. To a certain extent, it drives the arboricultural industry. You get paid to cut a tree, not to leave it. I might get paid to leave it, but there's an incentive to cut rather than to leave, and there's also the law and how we manage arboriculture. So they're the things I'm really going to be talking about. So with arboriculture, it's a relatively new science, if you can call it a science. This list I've given is a kind of very simplified list of some of the issues facing arboriculture. Ignorance and uncertainty, they're just things that we have to live with, in the sense that we don't know a lot of things about trees. We're a young science, we're a young industry, very weak on research, reliant on forestry for a lot of the research. And there's a load of stuff we just don't know. In addition to that, I think there's a bit of overconfidence and false assumptions which go on, which don't help. And then you've got the vested interest, which is, is there profit in removing a tree? So that's kind of the focus of tonight's talk. So in relation to just what I've just said, we've got what we know, and generally we can identify the tree species. We might be able to identify some of the associated species, i.e. fungi growing on or around those trees, maybe some of the insects. We may know something about the wood properties. Some research has been done, tree statics. But there's quite a lot of unknowns. We don't know the exact wind loading on any tree. We don't know what wind loading there has been on the tree before we look at it, and we don't know the wind loading on the tree after we look at it. We don't know the soil properties. We can investigate some of these, but generally speaking, we don't know them. And even if we investigate them, we don't know absolutely. The data is not going to be definitive. And we don't know rates of change. So in other words, if you identify a decay organism associated with a tree or a fungus associated with a tree, you don't know the rate at which that organism is influencing that tree. You may see indicators, but is the tree responding very positively, or is it stressed and therefore not responding so well? And in addition to known unknowns, you've got unknown unknowns. And I can't say very much about that because we just don't know what they are. So moving swiftly on. Conservation of arboriculture. I don't know if people use this term. I don't know if people like this term, but I quite like it. I think arboriculture is changing. I think tree ecology is becoming much more significant as a sort of discipline or a way of thinking and looking at trees. I think there's a bit of a kind of battle between science and belief, or science and accepted wisdom. There is some science in arboriculture, probably not enough, but science in itself probably isn't enough either. And so really where I'm going, and I think Jim will be as well, is trying to encourage people to think beyond traditional assumptions in arboriculture and being open to lifelong learning. Because if you're going to be good at arb, you're going to have to learn your entire life, because there's no point at which you're going to know it all. And the best you can do is realize how little you know. That's something I use, that's a phrase I use quite a lot. recognizing how little you know is an absolutely key thing to any natural history discipline, anything where you're working with the natural world. If you don't realize that you're only got part of the picture, then you're either kidding yourself or potentially telling porkies. So back to the core subject, why do we lose too many urban trees? The key things I'm going to talk about: tree risk management, development sites, and subsidence. I will not be talking about planting failures, biosecurity, climate change, and globalization of tree disease, which are all very significant, but I've only got half an hour, and trying to run it to tree risk, development sites, and subsidence is a bit ambitious. I'm going to mainly focus on tree risk, but to my mind, it is poor risk management, the effect of development, and the effect of subsidence, which are the primary drivers in our loss of trees, or unnecessary loss of trees, rather. And probably subsidence is a relatively small part of that picture. So what does risk management look like? What's acceptable risk management? Well, acceptable risk management is putting someone in a steel object and letting them drive it at 60 miles an hour towards someone else who they don't know, and they've got no idea of their skill as a driver, and then hurtling them towards someone else at 60 miles an hour and separating them with a white line. That is acceptable risk management, apparently, on our roads. This is a picture of a de Havilland comet. I stuck this in because of a conversation I had with a senior ARB consultant at the ARB conference, where we were talking about the fact that risk from trees is so low. Is it worth worrying about it that much? And his argument was, well, in that case, British Airways wouldn't worry about risk because the risk from flying is very low, which is true. But the analogy, I think, is a little flawed in that aeronautical engineering is a piece of cake compared to managing trees, because components in aircraft have known properties. Problem with the Decay Comet was it was the first jet airliner, and so no one understood quite what the consequence of pressurized cabins were as they go up, get pressurized, and come back down again. And a few, four, in fact, comets fell out of the sky because the airframe broke apart. Due to metal fatigue associated with compressurization and depressurization. So my point is, if you know exactly how your components are going to work, and they did work it out eventually, and you can measure them, and there's funding so that you can measure the life expectancy of every component, then you can do risk management to a very, very high degree of accuracy. The problem with us is we're trying to manage natural systems. And our variables are just almost impossible. What are the properties of the specific tree, or the wood in the specific tree that we're looking at? And where in the tree? What are the properties where in the tree? Active and passive defences, rates of decay versus reaction, historic wind loading damage. I managed not to spell damage right. These are massive variables. There's the fungi you can see, and there's the fungi you can't see, and then there's roots, soil conditions, wind, rain, snow, all sorts of stuff. I mean, most of the trees that fell in the 1987 storm, which was the kind of biggest wind event leading to massive millions of trees failing in the UK, most of them failed actually because the soil lost its cohesiveness due to huge amounts of rain. So the trees didn't really fail, the soil failed. And there's a lovely beech tree with Myriplus, and if we took a poll on this one, should that tree be felled, it would be quite an interesting cross-section of arboricultural opinion. But the truth is, some beech trees with Myriplus fail, and other trees seem to outlive the fungus. And there's a massive kind of disagreement within the ARB community alone on what the significance of Myriplus is on beech trees. So that's just one fungus on one species, and we're not even sure about that one. So it's tricky. So what did we do? Well, do some research. National Tree Safety Group was set up for this very specific purpose. It commissioned some research, and the research was very helpful. Basically, watch out for footballs. 250,000 people injured every year in the UK by footballs. If you manage to avoid football, be careful of wheelie bins. You are 40 times more likely to be injured by a wheelie bin than you are by a tree. That's just a statistical fact. Now, you know, this should put us in some perspective about why tree risk is a relatively, it shouldn't be taken too seriously. I'm not saying you don't take it seriously, but I'm just saying, get it in proportion. So, that's kind of my vague attempt at proportionality with that little baby tree. Risk of being harmed by a tree, roughly 1 in a million every year. Risk of being killed by a tree, 1 in 10 million. Just slightly below the risk of being killed by lightning. And obviously being killed in traffic accidents or injury and poisoning. According to the national statistics, injury and poisoning is what's going to get you, whatever that means. But National Tree Safety Group did this research, which is hugely helpful. So one of the people who helped with that research was Professor David Ball, and his opinion of reducing tree risk is that the prospects of reducing the risk from falling trees below the current level are remote and comparable to finding a microscopic needle in a gargantuan haystack. If you're looking at a 1 in a million risk, to reduce that risk is going to be really, really hard. You've got a declining rate of return. As your risk gets smaller and smaller, the resources you're going to have to put in to reduce that risk are going to get bigger and bigger and bigger. Especially if you really don't know what you're doing. And I'm not saying we don't know what we're doing, but we don't know what we're doing. I did just say that. So we end up with paranoid arboriculture. The problem with not knowing a lot of stuff is people get nervous. When you know something, you can make a judgment. Whereas when you don't know something, it's much, much harder. And so, here we have a 150-year-old cedar tree which had shifted its root plate. There was very definitely a obvious risk factor. Unfortunately, 7 years after the obvious risk factor developed, someone decided to fell the tree, despite the fact they didn't do an assessment of the target. Because you can see in that photograph that once the tree shifted, it was leaning towards a rose bush and a crabapple. And, I'm not sure a 150-year-old tree should be taken out because it might flatten a rose bush or a crabapple. I'm not really being flippant here. I'm serious. We can't afford to lose 150-year-old trees because someone hasn't done a target analysis. And this one, I found this one on the internet, and maybe people have seen this one before, but here we've got is that a 200-year-old oak? It was felled because a beech tree nearby failed due to Myrippus, and Myrippus can be transmitted to nearby trees. That's what it says on the website where I got this from. It was just a tree surgeon's website. Now, there are tree surgeons out there with less experience, and one would hope that this doesn't happen very often. But they say this was signed off by the council, so a tree officer must have read this. This isn't saying that this beech had this oak had Myrippus. This is saying a beech tree nearby had Myrippus, and that's why they felled it. So it's perfectly understandable that a homeowner might say, that great big beech tree fell over. What's going to happen with my tree? Yeah, your homeowner or someone who's not trained is perfectly entitled to say, am I at risk? But a professional's got to turn up at some point and say, well, no, the risk is very, 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 very low. So let's talk about risk, or more to the point, the thing that we really worry about, which is negligence. We get worried about getting sued. Those are professionals of us who do risk management. And what is negligence? So essentially, negligence is a breach of duty. You've got a duty of care and you breach that duty. But that in itself doesn't create a liability. Harm must result from the breach, not just harm, but harm that results from the breach. And the harm must have been a reasonable, foreseeable consequence of the breach. So there's 3 elements to it. So, you go survey a tree and miss a bracket fungus doesn't necessarily mean you're negligent. It might mean you're not a terribly good surveyor, but that's a different point. So, quick whiz round of reasonable foreseeability. Here you have a tree. It was obviously going to fail because it's got a bracket fungus on it. Note that I say that with a very strong tongue in my cheek. I should say here that I come at arboriculture, as a second career, and my main interest is the ecology side and veteran trees. And the advantage of dealing with veteran trees is we know we don't know what we're doing. We know there's so many variables. And so we're really what we do, and Jim and I both teach VETcert for the ancient tree form. One of the key things we teach is accept that you don't know, be open to learning, and don't kind of fill the void of what you don't know with kind of guesswork unless it's your best guess and you've got to do something. So we've got a tree that's fallen over in a storm, reasonable foreseeability. Well, in 2013, I got this stat. I think this stat comes from the GLA. It may not be entirely reliable, but it kind of serves the point. In 2013, over 4,000 trees were damaged or uprooted in London by Storm Jude. Storm Christian, Storm Jude had various names. None of those trees caused a fatality. That's 4,000 trees in London. There were 2 people killed in a gas explosion, which was blamed on a tree breaking a gas main. But I'm not that kind of really does stretch reasonable foreseeability, I think. So you've got your tree that fails and causes harm, and then you've got 4,000 other trees, or whoever knows how many, depends on the storm, depends on the event, that failed and didn't cause any harm. And then in addition to that, you've got all the trees that had similarly observable risk factors and didn't fail at all. So when you're looking at reasonable foreseeability, or rather when the courts are looking at reasonable foreseeability, this is the way they should be looking at it. Not, was it foreseeable that that tree might fail, but was it foreseeable that that tree would cause that harm in the context of whatever else went on during that particular event? Unfortunately, that isn't necessarily the way the courts look at it. So, a little bit on the law. The law is a combination of statute and case law. So, in other words, statute is what Parliament creates in the form of legislation, and common law, case law, is decided by judges when they decide cases. So, common law is just a build-up of case law, and therefore, expert witnesses giving evidence in cases can change the law. And they can change the law for everyone. And therefore, you have to be careful when you're giving evidence that you get it right. So a little analogy from the computer world, garbage in, garbage out. What's the relevance of that? Well, judges are a little bit like computers. If you tell a judge a load of nonsense, if the judge doesn't know any better and you say you're an expert, the judge might believe you. And unfortunately, this is what has happened in certain cases. So, my view, and this is a personal view, too often arboricultural experts giving evidence in these cases have created bad law by claiming to know things that they don't, by asserting things that aren't true, or by being too partial in their evidence in order to support a client. One of the key things about being an expert witness is you are a witness for the court. You are not a witness for a client. And so you have an obligation on the court to be objective. And this is the stuff that tends not to get flagged up in court. The stuff on the left is the stuff we kind of know, or at least we've got some handle on. Stuff on the right is the stuff we have very little handle on. I mean, yes, in some cases you will know some of it, but in many cases you won't know any of it. And if you're giving evidence, you've got a responsibility to say, but this is the bit I really don't know. Not make that pie chart look like a solid ball because you're claiming to know everything. So, to Whitley Parish Council versus Andrew Kavanagh. This case went to the Court of Appeal, but essentially it was a decision made at first instance by a judge, which was upheld by the Court of Appeal. And unfortunately, the Parish Council was not granted leave to appeal on law, only on the facts, at which point, arguably, Whitley maybe should have pulled out. But anyway, what went wrong in this case? Well, I mean, my view is a lot went wrong in this case. So one of the experts, and I'm not going to name anyone because this isn't about blame, this is just about trying to learn and do it better. But one of the experts said, a fungal bracket at or near the base of a tree is a sure sign of impending failure and would have mandated emergency treatment, most likely felling of the tree. Well, I don't know how many of you think that's right, but I don't. How many of you have you seen? How many of you have seen trees with bracket fungi on them where it's not impendingly failing or mandating emergency action? It's just not true. It is an obvious risk factor. It may require further investigation, but it's just not true to say it's an impending risk of failure, or let alone a sure sign of impending failure. Now, what happened in this case, aside from an expert debate about aging fruiting bodies on fungi, which was complete nonsense, is that the judge in first instance basically held the council to be liable because it had a 3-year inspection regime, not a 2-year inspection regime. And the judge held, because of the expert evidence, that if there had been a two-year inspection regime, the fungal bracket would have been noticed and the tree would have been felled. And, you know, that's just not true. The tree may or may not have been inspected. It may or may not have, fungal bracket may or may not have been found, and it may or may not have been felled. But the key thing is, 3 years before the tree did fail, it was inspected. There was no fungal bracket, so there was no obvious risk of failure. There was nothing to pull that tree out to say it needed further investigation. It was an accident. Sorry if I'm ranting. So if you look at the legal principle underlying the judgment in Whitley, it basically says that the breach of duty was having a 3-year cycle of inspections rather than 2-year. That was a breach of duty, which frankly is bonkers. The tree failure would not have happened if there'd been a 2-year cycle, and the tree failure was reasonably foreseeable as a result of the negligence, which was the 3-year inspection regime, even though it had no obvious defect. It makes no sense. Now, it's important to understand this kind of case law happens because all the issues aren't fully developed in court. What happens is cases end up going down kind of rabbit holes because of the way in which evidence evolves in the course of the case. And in this case, essentially, Whitley had probably employed someone who wasn't qualified to do their tree inspections. Therefore, the judge was out to nail them. And I mean, a man was very seriously injured by this tree. But given the expert report, which said that anyone would have felled the tree if they'd seen the bracket fungus, the judge is kind of forced into the position of saying, oh, well, therefore, there should have been a more regular inspection regime. Unfortunately, nobody mentioned the NTSG guidance, which was brand new at the time. And had the judge been told about the NTSG guidance, which says that 3-year inspections are appropriate even in high-use areas, he may have been a little bit more circumspect, and we might not have got such a bad Court of Appeal authority. And I know some people have said, well, it's a decision on its facts, it doesn't have that much weight. Frankly, it's Court of Appeal authority, and it's a difficult case. It kind of puts a lot of burdens on tree risk managers. And this is kind of the case which motivated me to do this talk, because I saw Martin Dobson's presentation at the ARB conference, and he talked about this case. And you know, I mean, although the judgment in this was good in that the council and the tree inspector were not found to be liable because there was no obvious risk factor, there was no negligence. Nevertheless, a different ARB consultant managed to say that there was. And as a result, it ends up all the way in court, despite the tree having been inspected, I think it was 3 times in the year before it failed. And there was no obvious defect. It fails in kind of pretty nasty weather after a storm. And I just want to hammer home the consequences of this type of tree failure litigation. One, you lead a victim or the victim's family to blame someone for their loss rather than to grieve. It does not do a victim family any good to think that an unavoidable accident was avoidable and was someone else's fault. You're not helping anyone. It also ruined the tree inspectors' lives in this case. The guy who was the principal tree inspector in this is never going to look at another tree again. It's hard enough having seen a tree that does cause a serious injury or a fatality without someone turning around and saying you were negligent. Especially when you weren't. And it creates tree risk paranoia, which leads to tree damage by unnecessary surgery and trees being felled unnecessarily. So please, can we be a bit more careful when it comes to expert evidence? Because it's one thing doing a tree risk assessment when you've got 5 minutes to look at a tree, or maybe less, and you've got a report on that risk assessment. I mean, in Whitley, the tree expert said it only takes 4 hours to do a risk assessment, and therefore it would be reasonable. What, how many? Yes, you can do a detailed risk assessment in 4 hours, but a routine risk assessment where you've got no obvious risk factor, 4 hours? It's just mad. I'm ranting. So what's going on? The problem is we've got a defect-led approach to arboriculture. Training such as professional tree inspection courses focus on what you can see rather than understanding the complexity. They focus on identifying risk features. It's no harm in identifying a risk feature, but you've got to understand the significance of that feature, not just jump on it. And there are some art consultants who do not understand risk, who are creating a climate of fear. And just one piece of kind of, this is scientific data. This is a published report, very recent one. Thanks to Jim for alerting me to this. This is an American study, 1,500 trees sampled or looked at before and after a hurricane. None of the defects assessed appeared to increase the likelihood of failure. So, this wasn't looking at fruiting bodies. This was looking at including bark and kind of crown forms and stuff. But every one of the assessed defects that they looked at, none of them failed. So, let's be realistic about what we do know and what we don't know. It's fine to try, but don't pretend you know everything. So that's the rant about tree risk. I'm now going to have a kind of very much briefer rant about development and subsidence. So this is the Happy Man tree, an A1 rated tree on a street. This is a street tree. It wasn't even on the development site. But it manages to get felled as part of a major development in the north of Hackney. I can't remember, I don't think it's Berkeley Homes. It's one of the other big housing contractors. And they basically felled this tree because they wanted to put some gas pipes under it, bearing in mind that gas is going to have to be phased out before too long, given climate change, and we're going to have to move away from fossil fuels. The big problem here is not the tree survey. The tree survey did fine. It was graded A1 as it should have been. But the planning system completely failed to protect it. And it failed because the planning system is biased and weak and is pro-development. And it is one of the big problems is where you've got major developments where you get outline planning permission long in advance of the development. And that tends to lead to a lack of scrutiny at the stage at which outline development is granted, which condemns trees a long way down the line. And the community around this tree only found that it was really threatened when it was too late. And they raised an absolutely fantastic campaign and made it Tree of the Year in 2020. But nevertheless, it still got felled. It shouldn't have been felled. It's a daft decision, and it exposes the weaknesses in the planning system. This is St Anne's Hospital site in Tottenham near me. It's just not what it says it is. I mean, this pretends to be a kind of social housing development. The social housing element will be in phase 3. It may or may not happen. Often with these very big developments, what happens is that the money is made on phases 1 and 2, and then phase 3, when it comes to be the social housing development, they say, "Oh, we've run out of money." And even if they didn't, I mean, what are you building? Are you building flats, or are you building investment units and debt prisons? Because who's going to own these things, and what are going to be their mortgages? Are they ever going to be able to pay it off? So basically, the planning system doesn't work. It doesn't work for trees, despite the best efforts of BS 5837, which is hopefully about to be updated. This is another site in North London. This is where Tottenham Hotspur are going to create 20% biodiversity net gain by putting a huge number of artificial football pitches on acid grassland, where there are orchids and grass snakes. It's nonsense. And there was a judicial review on this case only yesterday, where someone was challenging Enfield's preliminary lease to lease the land to Spurs. So hopefully that one won't happen, but we don't know yet. In terms of trees, there's 40 A1 trees on that site which are threatened. So what's going on with 5837? 5837 is the kind of British standard that governs how trees should be managed on development sites. Basically, there are cases where the trees are there's a significant underestimation of the life expectancy of the trees in order to undervalue the trees from A to B, B to C, C to U. false assumptions about planting replacement. We know planting replacement is far less beneficial than retaining the tree, and on and off-site RPAs, root protection areas, are often ignored. Some people are really good. Some people, pressure is brought to bear, and they're happy to undervalue trees. That means the system can't work, because only by valuing the trees accurately can the planning decision be made as to the pros and cons of the development. This is one in Walthamstow where we did actually manage to save a magnificent 100-year-old lime avenue, which arguably should have been rated A2, even though the individual trees are, some of them are not fantastic specimens. That is a fantastic lime avenue to have in the middle of Walthamstow, next to Walthamstow Station. And all those trees were underrated in the survey. I'm going to press on. I think you get the picture. This is a case where the development was designed with stakeholders involved. And so even though it was a major development site within the park, we managed to save 4 oaks, and they now add to the landscape. I'm very aware that saving trees on development sites can be a misconception if they get trashed during the development. So it's not just a question of trying to save every tree. You've got to be sensible. And I don't think I've got time to go into subsidence very much. The only thing I would really flag here is the new duty under the Environment Act to consult on street tree removal, which hopefully might give local authorities a little bit more leverage in kind of pushing back on subsidence. I would highly recommend Martin Dobson's AA training courses on subsidence, because it's a very complex area, and he's very good. I don't entirely agree with Martin in relation to his preferred remedy of felling the tree in some situations, but he does understand the complexity, and it's very worthwhile doing his courses if you want to get your head around subsidence. But there are other options, and unfortunately, as long as felling the tree is the cheapest and simplest option, or rather the go-to option, then the other solutions will not get the backing that they need in order for them to become more viable. And so my view on subsidence is that blaming a tree for the inadequacy of a building's foundations is a short-sighted, economically driven approach that denudes the environment and risks harm to public health. Because how many people die in London from air pollution? It's around 5,000 to 10,000 people a year, particularly in hot years. And we need trees. So you've got to weigh that into the balance, and it's not at the moment. And this is just one example of a current case I've got where, the consultancy doing the tree survey are recommending tree removal irrespective of the identification of recovered root samples. And this is the problem. It's not just that some of the existing arboricultural or legal parameters are flawed, it's that beyond those parameters, people push. So, the oak tree that gets felled because the beech tree nearby, it's just bonkers. And here, the tree up here, you can see my cursor near SG1, that's next to an extension which is on 5 meter deep pile foundations. That extension cannot move. And there's no evidence whatsoever that it is moving. But enough. I'm going to hand over to James Chambers to talk to you about decay detection. Thank you for listening. Over to you, Jim.
Okay, I'm there now. Thanks, Russell. That was great. I agree with you wholeheartedly, particularly about Whitley and subsidence. I could name the company as well. I'm not going to go into that. Thanks very much to John and Andrew as well for putting on this whole event. So yes, basically this is what I'm going to be talking about: decay detection. Not basically the problems that I've experienced recently. Or I've seen lots of instances where decay detection has been, in a similar way to what Russell was talking about, has been used to theoretically justify the removal of trees that didn't really need to be removed. So there's a lot to talk about. There's not a lot of time, so I'm going to probably rush this a little bit. I've tried to bring this down a little bit. There's a lot of information. Basically, decay detection is a really useful tool. It gives us a lot more information about trees and about the condition of a tree in whatever situation we find it in. It has its limitations, and it's really important to understand them. I've done loads and loads of tests over there. I don't no idea how many, loads and loads of tests. I'm very experienced, and I wouldn't hesitate to tell you that I'm still learning. And as I'll demonstrate later on, there are so many unknowns, as Russell touched on there, that we can't be too confident about knowing all that we think we do. We have to be very cautious about overstating what we understand. When I started out doing these tests, I made lots of mistakes. I got results that I didn't understand, and so in those situations, what I did was ask people. I returned. I use a Picus, which is supplied by Sorbus as one of the different tomographs that's available. This isn't a comparison between them, and so I sometimes, if I got a result I didn't understand, I'd send it back and ask what was going on with this. And in some cases, that was because I'd made a mistake or I misunderstood something. And that's how you learn, isn't it? Read the manual. There's loads of really useful information in the manual. Surprisingly, read it and read it again. John Haraway he was Mr. Picus. He's retired now, but he was the first user of the Picus in the UK, and he was phenomenally helpful. So generous with his time. He helped me out with loads of situations where I didn't understand what I was looking at. In fact, I've actually provided lots of results to him that he didn't understand either, and we had to work it out because it was really unusual results. Very interesting stuff. I'm not going to talk about those today. And particularly Paul Mellerange from Think Trees and Ian Barnes from Tree Diagnostics, both good friends of mine. Paul uses an Arbitom, and Ian uses a FACOP, and so that's not a rude word. An Arbitom isn't a medical condition. They're both different tomographs. They do the same job as the Picus. As I say, this is not a comparison between them. They all do the same job, but we have each experienced similar problems to those that I'm going to describe, and we have worked together. We share information. We do a lot of different specialist investigations, dynamic load testing, static load testing. We do a lot of these sorts of things, and we talk about the results we've got and compare notes, if you like, to share information. And I think that's a really important thing that doesn't happen enough in our profession. We shouldn't be locked into our silos, bigging ourselves up or trying to shut everybody else out. If we come across a situation that we don't understand, it's really helpful to talk about it. And that's really what the intention of my presentation is to do today. This is based on a lot of discussions I've had with Paul and with Ian. Paul and Ian and I produced a document which is freely available. Some of you may have seen it. I'll talk about that some more later. I will be showing you a lot of my own work and a lot of other people's work, which some of it I will be quite significantly criticising and for reasons I will thoroughly explain, but I want to be absolutely clear that I am not criticising any individuals. I'm certainly not going to name anybody. I'm not criticising any individuals, not consultants, not tree surgeons and arborists, not tree officers. This isn't about pointing fingers at people. This is about trying to share information so across anybody who's interested, because between us, our profession, we need to raise our game. We need to share this information so that we're all doing the best we can. And I'm sure that's what we are already doing. We're all doing the best that we're able to do. And as I've said, when I started out, I made mistakes. I did things wrong. I've learned a lot. I'm still learning. I want to share the things I've learned in the hope that, perhaps it will be beneficial to tree officers who might receive a report that they don't understand, or consultants who might produce a result that they're not fully understanding the detail of what it means. So it's really important to share all that information, and that's what this is all about. So I'm going to do a brief description. For many of you probably don't do decay detection tests, so I'm going to do a brief description of what they are and how they work, particularly sonic tomography, with a little bit about resistance drilling, what those limitations are, how we identify them, how we account for them, with lots of examples, a lot that are my own and a lot that are other people. And as Russell's touched on here, one of the big problems is that as a profession, generally speaking, there's a lot of people who are too risk averse, and that's not being dismissive of risk. There is always a risk relating to trees. Trees do fall over. There is the potential for harm to happen, and obviously we need to avoid that. But every time you see a storm, you hear about the one tree that went over or the two trees that went over. You don't hear anything about the tens of millions that didn't. So we have to be really have a balanced approach to this risk that does exist. And it's really important when we are investigating or inspecting a tree that we make our decisions about our recommendations based on what we do know and not what we don't know. If we are always trying to account for the unknown and manage an unknowable risk, then we're likely, I dare say, to compensate in some way and perhaps recommend works that that aren't necessarily justified. At the end of this presentation, there's a QR code which I'm told has my contact details in it. I'll give you another warning on the slide beforehand, just so if you want to do it, if you want to contact me. So please, if you feel that you've been affected by any of the information that's included in this presentation, please feel free to reach out and we can discuss it. So, decay detection. With a tomography, sonic tomography, this is a tomograph. It produces a tomogram. Basically, you where you've got a tree where you suspect or you know there's some decay. In this example, you can see there's fungal fruit bodies and a bit of a cavity. You attach the sensors around the tree with using nails. So you bang nails into a tree. You can see that's questionable for a start. And then you tap each sensor in turn, and a sound wave is produced, which transmitted across the tree, and all the other points will have sensors on which measure how long it takes the sound wave to travel across. So basically, it may surprise you to know that this doesn't detect decay. It actually just measures the sound waves, and the sound waves will travel more quickly through soundwood and more slowly through or around decay. This is a tomogram. You can see at the top there's an indication of the scale at the top. So brown on the left represents fast movement, and blue on the right is slow. And as I say, in general terms, slow is decay and fast is good wood. One thing I'll also mention, look, with all the tomograms that are my own, I will also mention what recommendation I made, just as an example, because lots of people would look at this tree, for example, this example here. This tomogram isn't from that tree, by the way, it's not connected, but that looks like an awful lot of decay, and it is. But if you look at the soundwood that's all the way around the circumference, that's intact. In this instance, my recommendation was to do nothing, and that was many years ago, and the tree is still there. This is another tree example. You can see here Bluetooth calipers, which are used to accurately measure where your sensors are around the trunk. And this is an absolutely crucial point, which I'll come back to in a second. Again, as I mentioned earlier, this is not a comparison, but this is the one on the left is a Picus tomogram. The one on the right is a FACOP tomogram from Ian. That's an Arbitom tomogram from Paul, and this is another Picus one. These 4 tests were all done on the same tree at different times. The 2 on the left were done with 12 sensors, and the 2 on the right were done with 18. Just to show you an example, you can see they're all pretty much the same. They do the same job. It's, as I mentioned, it's just different equipment. And the fact that each of Ian and Paul and myself all use different equipment is helpful when you consider that we're comparing the same kinds of issues. It's not about one set of kit over another. This is straight out of the Picus manual. Again, I'll be talking about the Picus a lot because it's the one I use, but the system defaults to a circle, or you can change it to an elliptical assumption, as it describes it, or you can use calipers to precisely locate the shape of the tree according to where you've placed the sensors. And this is an example of why. You can see there that the extent of decay is quite different in those 3 shapes. Even in the manual, it does clearly state you shouldn't be using a circular assumption. Every single user of sonic tomography knows that you don't use a circular assumption unless your tree is also a circle. If your tree is not a perfect circle and you use a circular assumption, your tomogram will be at best inaccurate. Now, here's a number of tests. These are just random pictures, really. Brown pretty much indicates good wood. The other colours indicate degrees of decay as shown by the scale across the top. Just to rattle through these are just examples of what you might be looking at. So if you get a tomogram and it looks something of this type, where you can see effectively what's good wood and where there's decay, then that's not so bad. Again, this one on the top, it's got a lot more central area of decay with a lot of sandwood around. No works on that recommendation, by the way. You can use a lot of more sensors for bigger trees, and you'll get, that can be very helpful. This is another very big tree with another very big amount of decay inside. Again, no works recommended for that tree, because you have to also consider things you can't see in this image. The physiological condition of the tree, the vitality, the reaction wood, all these other factors are not included in the tomogram. Remember that this tomogram is simply a representative slice at the height of the tree that you've tested it at, and it gives you really good information, but it's just one element of the puzzle, and it's one part of the whole picture. This is a very large veteran oak tree, masses of decay from what you can see there. This highlights one of the issues that is true, certainly of Picus and to some degree with both the other tomographs, is that due to the very nature of the way the tomogram is constructed, there is a tendency for decay to be exaggerated around the circumference. You can see, if you can see my mouse, around 23 and 24 and 5 and 6 and 14, it looks like there's no wood there at all. In reality, there is. We'll come back to this. So there is a tendency when there is, basically, it's a sonic, something that's disrupted the sonic wave. An acoustic delay has been caused either by decay, or it could be by another interference, perhaps a crack, or perhaps a bark inclusion, or something of that nature. So you can't assume that that's all decay. One of the things I hope you'll notice about all of these tomograms I've just rattled through is that none of them were circles. Here's a circular tomogram just as an example. Can you see how the colouring there has, well, it's all over the place. If you've got this darkest area is somehow in the middle, and it's apparently less solid around the edge, it's not a very accurate tomogram. The tree was not a circle. This is not a good tomogram. When I've started doing tests or talked to new clients about doing these tests, on occasion years ago, a couple of them said to me, well, we don't want to do any of that. We don't trust that. We don't believe in that equipment. And that seemed to me to be a very strange thing for them to have said, until I saw the results that they'd been given by other consultants before I got there. This is an example of a tree which is not actually a circle, and it's got these cogwheel effect around the side. I'm not going to go into all the details about what that means, but it's a known function or a known factor that occurs sometimes with sensors that might be placed too close together, and it can be compensated for. But this obviously hasn't been done when somebody's provided this result, and that red line, out of interest, is a TR ratio, which we shouldn't be using. We'll come back to that. TR ratio is not very good, not very useful. This is a quick example of a tree that I tested recently. It's a pine tree with a big limb that failed. Any of us who do these tests, particularly with Picus, you'll know that when you're using the calipers, the third set, you have to use the left button instead of the right button. There's no point in me trying to explain that to everyone else, but very briefly, I think you'll all appreciate that when you're standing around wearing a high-vis jacket, banging nails into the bottom of a tree, it's not uncommon for somebody to come up and ask what the hell you're doing. So the combination of those two things, I'm using the calipers to measure the position of the sensors, and somebody starts talking to me. I make a mistake and don't press the right button at the right time. And so this is the end of the day. It was really cold. It was getting dark. It was raining. I know that I can adjust the tomogram using the software. So I carried on. And this is a really interesting example, I thought. If you look at the tomogram on the left and look at points 8, 9, and 10, they're on the wrong side of an imaginary line. I'm not going to explain what that means, but if you look at them on the right-hand image, I've moved those to the correct point, as you can see in the photo of the tree, and that's the difference in the tomogram. This is one really good example of why it's so important to accurately describe the shape of the tree when you're doing the test. You must describe the shape of the tree accurately, or your tomogram will be inaccurate. It's unlikely that it will be this inaccurate. That's really surprising to me, but you can't rely on a circular tomogram or any tomogram that doesn't represent the true shape of the tree at the point you're testing it. It's really important. And additionally, when you receive a report, you should have information about where the test was taken, including photos, because how can you understand what's been done otherwise? So again, accurate shapes. Whatever it is, whatever the shape is, you've got to find that accurate shape. Another quick example here is there are lots of different variations in the software, lots of tools you can use. I'm not going to explain all of those. One thing that's really useful is this line diagram, which gives a visual representation of how the tomogram is created. And there's a point in me explaining this. If you can see that the black line is the fastest velocity and time of flight that's recorded, and the white lines are the slowest. So this is how the tomogram is built. You can see where all the overlapping light colored lines are. That's where the most decay is, because that's where all the slow lines overlap. There are overlapping fast and slow lines, and that's where the algorithm comes in to work out which is most accurate. But one thing this does point out as well is that there are no intersections around the circumference, which is why, as I mentioned earlier, it's very common for decay to be exaggerated at the circumference, and so you have to look out for that. In this instance, there was a big hole there, so that's clearly defined. We know that one's accurate. Here's another really good example of how to make sure you put the sensors in the right place. Lovely big old poplar with rigidoporus. I'll just quickly show. This is the first tomogram I created. At the bottom, of the test, you can see that looks like it's quite a lot of decay. If you remember the colours, brown is wood, green and pink and blue are beginnings of decay. That wasn't accurate, and I've realised that I'd placed the sensors in the wrong place. So these two tomograms show you the exact same tree being tested at the same time with a slightly different position of the sensors, and you can see there's quite a big difference in the results. The tomogram on the right shows much more of the surrounding wood, which is actually present, rather than it all looking like it's really degraded as it does in this tomogram, and that's purely because I placed the sensors in the wrong positions, and when I corrected that, it gave a much more realistic result. Again, no works recommended for this tree. Here's another really good example. If you look at the numbers here, this is a lime tree with a cavity on the other side. Look at the numbers there, 1, 2, 3. You can see where they are. The cavity is on the other side of the tree. That's the reason the tree was being tested in the first place. Here you can see apparent decay right out to the bark of the tree. This is the point that we're looking at. There is no cavity there. There is no damage there. You can tap it with a sounding mallet and hear that it's intact. And in this case, I did a quick drill into that point with drill, which I'll explain in a minute, to show that there is soundwood there. But the point is that this is one of the limitations of the equipment because of the way the tomograms are built. This is a very common situation. So if you receive a tomogram that shows decay all the way out to the edge of the circumference, you need to be able to know from that report that there is also a hole there, or is this just one of the limitations of the equipment? In this one, I thought it'd be very interesting to test the tree again. So I added 3 more sensors. I produced another tomogram, and you can see the difference there. This is exactly the same tree again. You can see that most of the sensors haven't been moved. I simply added 3 on the left-hand side here, and you can see a much more realistic tomogram. The shape of the tree is apparently changed, and there's much more soundwood there. Again, just using more sensors on exactly the same tree in the same position can really provide very much more realistic results. Again, no works for that tree. Very quickly, these 4 tomograms were all produced from the exact same piece of data. I did one test, and all of these are slightly varied because of slightly different settings in the software. It's very important as a user to understand these changes, and the changes that I've made here, I won't try to explain the detail of what they are, but these are very basic and should be used by any user for virtually every tomogram that you get in order to reach the most accurate representation of the tree. And the way you work out which of these is the most accurate is by either using other equipment like a drill or a increment borer or a sounding mallet or your VTA skills. This is just one tool which gives you one piece of information, and it's really important to use your other skills to make the assessment. You can see that the tomogram on the left and the tomogram on the right are quite different. This isn't a linear scale. These are just different versions, but you can see that the extent of decay, or more accurately, the amount of good wood that's remaining on the right is much more significant than the one on the left. Again, no work recommendations for this tree, or to be honest, actually with this tree, because this was many years ago, my recommendation was to test it again. I didn't charge the client. I went back and tested it again because I wanted to understand it better. Now, using that line diagram that I explained earlier, you can see here that all these slow lines are crossing this big area of decay. But I talked a lot with John Harroway about this one, and if you look at the middle of that big area of apparent decay, the fastest transmissions were directly across the stem, which means that there isn't a pattern of decay there. The slow readings were from either side, and this is much more likely to be a vertical crack or bark inclusion, something of that nature, which slows the sound waves across the stem and of course appears as decay in the tomogram. So again, this is a clear limitation of the equipment. This is the same with any of the tomographs. It's really important to understand that it's not actually detecting decay, it's just measuring the speed of sound waves as they travel across the stem, and anything that acts as an acoustic barrier will be displayed as decay in the stem. It looks the same. It doesn't know what the difference is. I mentioned the drill, resi drill. In this case, very, very narrow drill bit, which you drill into the tree. This gives you very accurate data for the exact point that you're testing. But of course, it's limited to that point. It's a 3 mil, something like that, 5 mil drill bit that drills into the tree. The peaks and troughs represent the levels of resistance as it pushes into the tree. You can see here another example where there's a lot of decay in this example. This peak here is a barrier zone, internal barrier zone, which you can detect with the Resi, unfortunately only by breaching it. But you're only testing a tree when you already suspect there's some decay and you want to learn more about the condition of internal condition of the tree. Here's a lovely big old red oak that I tested years ago. Masses of decay that looks really hollow. Looks like I can imagine some people looking at that and going, "Oh, okay, that's obviously got to be felled." But given what I've already explained about the tendency for decay around the circumference to be exaggerated and the potential for this apparent decay to be caused by something else, a crack or bark inclusion or whatever, I've used the drill at key points around the tree. So my first step is always to do a sonic tomogram, because that involves just banging a few nails in. It's not that invasive. If that result isn't clear enough, then I'll use the drill, which is narrow, which is I can't explain all the details about the pluses and minuses here. We don't have time for that, but it's localized damage to a tree where I want to determine what's going on. You can see here what these graphs mean, that you can see from the directions. These higher resistance means that that's intact wood. So for example, at this point at 5, it's got about 30 centimeters of good wood at around the circumference, which is not shown in the tomogram. And this one, you can't see it very clearly in this example, but we'll come back to it. In 23, there are 2 little drops there, which are really important. I'll show those in another tomogram. Basically, what all these graphs show is that there is a significant amount of soundwood remaining around the circumference, despite the extent of the decay that's indicated in the tomogram. My recommendation for this tree was to manage a long extended branch and continue to review the tree. That was years ago. It's still there. Here's a lime tree, similar situation. The reason we tested this tree is because it's almost paper-thin bark here at 0.3 by measuring 0.3, but that decay was significantly exaggerated, and I could tell that. So I drilled into the tree, even for a lime, which we know don't compartmentalize very well. You can see here there's almost 40 centimeters of wood remaining up at this point, measuring point at 14, and here you've got a good 20 centimeters before incipient decay has started, so even that wood isn't fully decayed yet. In this case, my recommendation was to leave the tree and test it again in 2 years. Here's an example of a tomogram from a sweet chestnut. This one may look like one of those dodgy circular tomograms. You can see there's a little bit of decay there that was the reason for the test in the first place. This isn't a dodgy circular tomogram. This is accurately, it was pretty much almost a circular tree. There was no other indication of decay. I didn't think that was likely to be the case, so I've drilled it at the same height. And you can see here there's a couple of little drops in resistance, and the same from the other direction. These are probably ring shake or possibly bark inclusions, and they are acoustic barriers. So the reason that tomogram shows all that decay is because of these, let's say, cracks, which have slowed the sound waves. There's no decay there. So again, there's no works for that tree. It's important to understand these things when undertaking these tests and when you receive these reports. There are occasions when both sonic tomography and resistance drilling into apparently sound wood, so the tomogram shows apparently solid wood, the resistor graph shows high resistance, which all of that indicates, but there are sometimes you just know there's something else going on. And for myself, what I tend to do in that is to use an increment borer to extract a core, which I then use Matic's shake test, or in this case, it falls apart as soon as you take it out because of brown rot. That's another thing that's really important to consider, the type of decay that you might be dealing with. You may know because you might have seen a root body, you may not. It may not be apparent. So you extract the core, and I tend to shake it about. Oh dear. And so in this case, this is a tree that was apparently solid with the other tests that I've done, but it was significantly degraded wood. It was embrittled, which in the early stages may not be detected by either sonic tomography or resistance drilling. This tree, lovely old tree, I just recommended a crown reduction. Don't know why that's showing again. Right. Interestingly enough, I know that Ian Barnes prefers to use the increment borer as his second line of defense, so to speak, and to use the resistor graph or similar drill after that, if that doesn't turn. And that's a reasonable, there's a good conversation to be had about that. It certainly makes sense. If you look at this picture here, there are pluses and minuses to using either. I use the drill and then the increment borer, but there's a perfectly good case for using it another way. The hole you can see on the left, you can see my mouse. That's the nail hole from the pickers test. Here is a hole from the increment borer I took out of this tree, and these two holes here are from the drill, just to give you an indication of the types of damage that is done when you're doing these tests. There is a level of invasiveness. Everything you do is causing a small amount of damage, but as I said, we're only using this equipment where we suspect there's already decay, and we're trying to quantify it. Electrical resistance tomography is another perfectly useful tool. I admit, hold my hands up straight away, I don't currently use this. I'm not an expert in it, and I'm not going to talk about it in any detail. The advantages that I am aware of is that it's unlikely to be fooled, if you like, by things like cracks and bark inclusions in the trunk. Ian uses this, and he's told me about some of the limitations. For example, can be significantly affected by temperature, and I understand that moisture content can also affect the reading. So these are limitations that you'd have to be aware of when using that equipment. Again, I'm not going to talk any more about that because I don't know enough about it. Types of rot. We talk about this Kretschmeria fruit body soft rot. It's another one that you may have heard the tale. You can't detect soft rot with sonic tomography. Well, I challenge that. It's not true. This is a tree I tested years ago with Kretschmeria. That's very significant decay. I was absolutely shell shocked when I got the result because I expected to find nothing. Just out of interest, the lowest velocity recorded is still significantly high. I should have explained earlier that in a tomogram, every reading, every single tap is compared with the other taps or the speeds that are recorded in that tomogram. So it's all relative to the same test. Doesn't refer to a chart, an external list of speeds of wood. It's all relative to the other taps in that same test. So that's a very atypical result from a Kretschmeria affected tree. It was in a school playground. You can see what my recommendation was. A friend of mine was actually the person that felled the tree, and you can see there that was an extraordinarily good representation using sonic tomography of where the decay was. This is a much more typical result of a tomogram where soft rot is present. And if you compare this with the type but even the previous one and the type that I've shown earlier, where the pink and the blue are representative of significant decay, this doesn't look like that. You could, if you weren't careful, you could look at that and go, "Oh, it looks all right. It's not so bad," because all of the colouring is to the left, if you like, of the scale at the top. But I haven't got the results here now, but I knew that what this was. I knew this was wrong. I drilled into this side and it was mush. There was virtually no wood to the north and to the east. Very little wood remaining. There was still some good wood, very good wood on this side, which is why the tree was still standing. It was a sycamore, needless to say, my recommendation in this case was to remove the tree, and that was the right choice. Here's a fantastic sequoia. This is a very interesting case. This is one of Paul Malone's job, Think Trees. He was asked to inspect this tree because of the decay that you can see at the bottom of the base hill to better assess that. He got this horrific tomogram, which the colours are different in the arbortom. So the green represents good wood, pink and red represents decay. He knew that was wrong. Obviously, he looked at it straight away and thought there's something very wrong here. We've been friends for years. He called me and we talked about it. And so we spent an entire Saturday with him testing it again with the pickers just to see what the difference would be. We're quite keen to do this. We've done this lots of times where we just spend all day testing the hell out of sciencing the hell out of various trees to see what results we get. So interesting results there, quite similar. One of the things with the pickers, you can add more sensors. So this is the first time I did it, come to think of it. And Paul and I did the test together. We added another 18 sensors, so we used 36. Lovely tree, well worth spending the time on it. So we used 36 sensors and record, and you can see there's quite a difference in that result there, but still vast amounts of apparent decay, which didn't make any sense to us because I should add this was years ago, which we're looking at a very relatively young for a sequoia, healthy looking tree. There's a comparison between the three tomograms, both Paul's and mine with 18 and then my one with 36. You can see how adding the sensors adds more detail, and so that's apparent there. There was another stump in the garden, and this you can see in these pictures of the stump, the bark inclusions and the cracks within the stem. So we were clear that this was very likely what was going on. I had the drill with me, but because it was only a 300 mil drill and you've got 12 centimeters of bark, we wasn't able to tell very much. We wouldn't be able to get results that would help us determine what was going on in the whole of the trunk. But we could tell from this, just looking at these growth rings. That's another thing you can do with the picus on occasion. With the resi on occasion. As we extrapolated from that this magnificent 30-meter sequoia tree was approximately 80 years old. Quite a lovely tree. Sadly, we weren't able to, well, to be fair, we weren't able to prove that the tree wasn't as decayed as it looked, but that wasn't the reason. Sadly, the owner of the tree had personal reasons, decided that he wanted to remove the tree. So despite, we couldn't affect that. It wasn't just because we couldn't prove it was decayed. But Paul asked him if he would fell the tree at the height we'd done the test. So at least we got some useful information out of it. Now you can see here there is an area of decay there, but everywhere else is just bark inclusions and cracks. And so we sort of proved that we were right after the fact, and so that was very useful information. Now I have tested other. Just to quickly show you, this is the so-called crack detector in the Picus software. It's a misnomer. As you can see there, it doesn't actually detect cracks. It would be more accurate to call it the significant difference in velocity between adjacent measuring points detector. That doesn't really roll off the tongue in the same way, and it doesn't. So it's not very effective. But it's a tool in the box that might encourage you to look at a specific point. If it doesn't make sense that there's a change there, it can be a helpful tool to guide you to investigate something a bit further. Just to quickly show you that the Arbortom also uses line diagrams. So does the FACOP. That's very similar. Just another quick point. There's not a lot of point in looking at it when you've got 36 sensors, because that's just a mess. Anyway, and very quickly, all four of these tomograms were produced from the same data. Just to show you again the difference. This is slight. These are very basic adjustments. There are a whole host of other adjustments you can make, but these are among the most basic adjustments you can make to any tomogram that you achieve in a Picus software. And I dare say it's essential to vary the tomogram using these features in order to try and determine the most accurate representation in almost every case. Just to quickly throw it in here, the one on the left, that's a really good example of an absolutely useless tomogram. To have something with all this scattered colouring over this area and so much blue. Imagine if you're looking at, you've seen the scale across the top. If this is all decay, there's no way that tree would be standing. If you ever see a tomogram with this much blue and this scattered colouring, it is useless. It will tell you nothing about the tree. All it tells you is there's something very wrong with that reading, and that could be for a number of reasons. But that's all that's telling you. So it's very important. And just to be clear, that's the initial result. All of the adjustments are the baseline result will be that one on the left, and all of these others are produced by making slight adjustments to the software. I was recently asked to test another sequoia, and as soon as we were asked, I kind of went, "Oh well, yeah, I know all about this. I've tested several sequoias. I know what they're like. They have cracks in them." I had one of the level 4 students, Will, join me on this one, and I thought, well, because he's here, he needs to understand about tomography. I'll test this tree with the tomogram. I wouldn't normally bother. I just use the drill. I know all about this. It's bound to show lots of decay, which isn't really decay. It's a waste of time. I know exactly what I'm doing. Except, of course, actually, I'm an idiot. And in this case, there were no cracks, there were no bark inclusions, and there was no apparent decay. Will was very forgiving. So anyway, it was an interesting one that it just goes to show you, you never know. We're all still learning. I expected this to be a lot worse than it was, and it wasn't. But there you go. It was only a few weeks ago. So still learning, and that's how it should be. Here's another really lovely job. This is a lovely home oak. Kind of rush through this one. Ganoderma resinaceum, I think, at the base of the tree. Another fungus. Can't remember what it was. And some decay higher up in the stem. This tree, Paul and I did this job together years ago now. This was an absolute bracerama before we got there. I don't know why. There was lots and lots and lots and lots of bracing in the tree. So Paul got up in the tree and did his assessment in the crown, while I got busy down at the bottom of the tree and did a nice tomogram at the bottom. Lots of decay, but lots of sound wood. And given what we know about the potential for exaggerated decay around the circumference, I wasn't too worried about that. That's all fine. So again, really useful to provide photos like this in the report, because it explains where the test was done and it helps to understand what's going on. Really basic to do. The software does it itself, or you can use Photoshop, something like that. I mean, it's really quite usual. While Paul was finishing up his acclaimed inspection, I set up another test, as you can see, to assess the decay higher in the stem, because you can see all that weight above all those stems. You don't want to have that, problem up there. And I'll admit that I was somewhat surprised to get this result. Now, again, absolute garbage. What does that mean? It means nothing. It means there's something very wrong. So after scratching my head for a little while, I adjusted the software and it gave me that result. So I thought I was getting something a bit better from this side of the stem, because that looks a little bit more realistic. But what the hell is going on that side? I stood around thinking, I don't understand what's going on in this situation. After a little bit further investigation, I found that the top of the tree had been filled in with concrete. Now, nobody mentioned that to us, and this wasn't visible straight away from ground level, and it was covered with leaves and so on and so forth. Paul found it, and we both had a good laugh about it. So, concrete is another acoustic barrier. There's no sound waves going to pass through the concrete, so it looks the same as decay in the test. So what I did in this case was split the tomogram. That provided enough information about each side, and again, I was quite happy with that. Irony of ironies, our recommendation was to add more bracing. Anyway, so why do we lose so many trees? One of the reasons that we lose tree is because of this exaggerated sense of risk and decay. This is a page from David Evans of Valid fame, which is an excellent description about safety factors and not strength loss, and not exaggerating, not using things like the TR ratio. The TR ratio is basically talks about a circular shape and the amount of the radius that remains. It doesn't consider the properties of the material. It doesn't consider the loading on the tree. It doesn't consider the extent of the crown. It doesn't consider adaptive growth. It's really a tool that we should not be using. It's had its time. It's come and gone, and it's not effective. And it actually, if you use the TR ratio, there's so many trees that would fail the TR ratio, which are actually perfectly fine. Particularly the most important trees of all, which are veteran trees. Veteran trees often hollow out, and the crown retrenches and gets lower, and the circumference is intact and it's completely hollow, but it's stronger than ever. And one of the key things to talk about is section modulus, which is described in this document. I encourage you to look up this document, but it mentions the ruler. If you can see there that a ruler, if you hold the ruler edge on to yourself like that, you can bend it quite easily. If you turn it face on like that, you can't bend it at all. It's exactly the same amount of material. It's just that the distance from the neutral plane in the middle has increased, and there's a distinct mechanical advantage as the distance from the neutral plane in the middle increases. This is what section modulus is all about. And so if you consider a trunk, it's about the remaining wood around the circumference, not the amount of decay in the middle. Tree calc is also mentioned. That's a really useful tool, which has its limitations, but it gives you can calculate a baseline safety factor, and then you can adjust that with the information you might gather from a decay detection test. I'm not going to try and describe that in great detail now. I just don't have time, but tree calc's a really useful tool, well worth looking up. This is a picture from one of Frank Grinn's publications. If you look at if we imagine that this is a tree trunk, a cross section of a tree trunk, two tree trunks, and all other things being equal, they're the same size, same shape, same tree, same wind loading. Which of these is stronger? Which is weaker? The one on the right is a TR ratio of 1/3. In fact, they're exactly equal in strength. If all other factors are equal, they are exactly equal in strength. And the same is true of these two. This is a TR ratio of 1/3 and a TR ratio of 1/5. As you can see, there's a difference in the shape and the size, but the strength, all other things being equal, is the same. And it's also important to consider that large old trees will often have far lower than a TR ratio of 1/3, but they will stand for decades. And so it's really important to stop looking at hollowing and decay as an automatic negative risk, danger, big problem, particularly with veteran trees, but even with younger trees. You don't get veteran trees if you don't have younger trees. If the trees are all removed as soon as there's the slightest hint of decay, then you're not going to end up with any more veteran trees. We should be looking at these as features. They are habitat value. There's a whole load of factors that are positives about these things. Of course, there is a potential risk of tree failure, and we must assess that realistically, but we shouldn't start from the point of view of what if this fails and try and work back from that. We should be looking at what's the realistic prospects here. How can I assess this? What's the basic safety factor using tree calc or similar? Something else this is a tree calc. I can't go through it now. This is a tree calculation. You pay for each calculation, and it can give you a safety factor, which again, it does have limited values. It's based on general properties and known factors, and it's not specific to the tree you're looking at. So you have to bear that in mind. Adbian is a new system which has been created by our friends at Safe Trees in Czech Republic, and it's another outstanding tool. It's very new. I encourage you to look into it. With this one, you can. It's a similar. I hope I'm not doing anyone a disservice by suggesting it's similar to tree calc in its intentions. You can use calibrated photographs of the tree that you're assessing. You can take a 3D scan of the stem, and including cavities, and it will include that in the calculation. And you can also add in tomograms, and that will be part of the calculation as well. Of course, it also has its limitations. I'm just putting that in there because if you're interested in trying to discover more about this calculating safety factors, this might be a useful tool. So I encourage you to look that up. Here's just some pictures of some trees that I was going to talk about earlier. Showing no works for either of those. Again, with this tree, lots and lots of decay, it's a big veteran tree, had loads of weight above it, so I recommended a phased reduction, but no more than that. Cherry tree with decay, no works. Another oak tree with decay, no works. This is a lovely old veteran tree. There is a very strong case to be made for not testing veteran trees with sonic tomography. Certainly, you should never test or allow to be tested a tree unless the user of the sonic tomograph is very experienced, because it will always exaggerate the decay for the reasons I've already touched upon. And so if you're looking for decay in a decayed tree, you're going to find a big problem. There's no real, there is some value in doing it, but you have to be so careful about that. So I'm not saying never test them, but you have to be very careful about the reasons you're testing it, and you have to fully understand the results. Just a quick example of this tree, you can see the independent functional units, the Lonsdale columns, are very likely to be underrepresented in an old veteran tree because of the limitations of the equipment. And you can see here we've got apparent, very thin wall at both sides of the north and south there, but that's simply not true. It's just part of the system. I've showed you with that red oak, there could be 30 centimeters of wood there. In this case, I didn't even drill the tree because I knew it was fine. Again, no works recommended. This is a gorgeous tree, absolutely lovely. There's a massive cavity underneath it, but there's also, you can see how dark these buttresses are. The tree is coping very well. It's fine. I didn't even recommend further testing. It's fine. Just leave it alone. Again, a couple of lovely old beech trees, veteran trees. No works. Lovely trees. Here's some. This is an example of a test that was done by someone. This one's mine, but a previous test was done by someone else. Again, I want to reiterate and stress. I'm not anything. I'm not criticising the individual. I don't know the individual. I've never spoken to them. I'm not criticising them for this result, but I am criticising the actual result. This. It uses far too few sensors. You can see that the tree is 145 centimeters across at that point. It's far too few sensors. More sensors gives better resolution. This doesn't really mean anything. This is a very, very vague. It's not a correct shape. I don't know what happened there. One of the reasons why people often use too few sensors is because in the software itself, when you put in the dimensions, sometimes it gives you, in fact, whenever you do it you can do it through the console or through the tablet. When you do it through the tablet, it will always recommend too few sensors. I don't know why that is, but if you don't know that, you just go with what it's recommending, I'm sure. So I tested the tree. The original client that received the previous test, unfortunately, the previous result recommended felling this tree. So luckily, the owner of the tree wasn't convinced, and I've been asked many times to comment on other people's reports and provide second opinions and to retest trees that others have tested and said fell. That's happened a lot. So In this case, I was asked to test the tree. I tested it again. You can see where that was. It's quite low down. Because of what I know about the decay being exaggerated around the circumference, I've used the drill. From what these drill results show you, there is a column of decay in the area, but there's actually the vast majority of the stem at that height is sound. I tested it again a bit further up. Why not? There was another fruit body further up. We'll do whatever amount of testing needs to be done to get to the required information. And that tree was fine. So this report said fell the tree. My report said do nothing. I don't know how many years ago that was. The tree's still there. This is a really unfortunate situation. Again, this is a complicated one. Again, I'm not criticising any of the individuals involved, so let's be clear about that. This is a lovely old oak tree. It was tested by another. Do I need to say anything about that tomogram? That tomogram tells us nothing about the tree, sadly. The red line is the TR ratio. The fact that they've included the TR ratio is an alarm bell straight away, because the TR ratio is rubbish. We shouldn't be using it. I didn't see any information about where they'd actually done the test. It may have been there, I can't remember the detail, but unfortunately they recommended the tree was felled. Fortunately, there was a great public uproar about that, so another consultant was asked to test. Unfortunately, I was busy and I couldn't get there. I was asked to comment on all these tests. Now, this is a test by another consultant. Again, I'm not having a go at them, but straight away, there's a big problem I can see in this test here, and that's because if you look there, the distance between these two measuring points is huge. This is totally unrepresentative of the true shape of the tree. There should be at least 2, maybe even 3 sensors in this gap. If you've got a great distance like that, clearly the sound wave is going to be taking longer to travel between those sensors. Clearly it's going to exaggerate the decay. And exactly the same on the other side of the tree. This is out on a buttress. There should be another sensor there. Should probably be another sensor there. Again, I'm not having a go at the people. I don't know the people. I've not spoken to them. I'm not having a go at them, but I'm explaining why this is wrong, and this is why this is another really poor tomogram, which tells you very little about the condition of the tree. And again, big alarm bell. It's got the TR ratio in it. The TR ratio shouldn't be used. It's not useful. It's not helpful. Unfortunately, because of the political situation and the risk managers taking over the situation, this tree was felled. We can see there was some small pockets of decay and there's some cracks. There's absolutely no reason, based on this evidence, that tree should have been removed. It could have outlived us all, and it was done based on these really poor results. And again, it's a very, very unfortunate situation. Worse still, there was another tree at the same site, and that same situation happened. This is the first tomogram. Unfortunately, well, I don't need to repeat what I've said already. This is the same contractor who did the second. Again, I want to stress that I'm not having a go. If you know how to set these tests up and you're doing the test to your best of your ability, this is where you're going to end up. I'm not having a go at the people who've done this test. They've done their best. I'm sure they haven't done. There's no ulterior motives here. They've done what they thought was right, and they've been perhaps they weren't sure about the results. I don't know, but in any case, both of these consultants recommended that the tree was removed. In this case, you can see another huge gap between the sensors. My aim in pointing this out is to arm tree officers with the information they need to see these kind of flaws when they get reports. And if anybody who does these kind of tests isn't aware of these kind of problems, please listen and let's talk about it, because this is again awful tomogram, very unrepresentative of the reality, and very unfortunately this tree was felled. There's a big crack in there and there's some localized decay. Absolutely no justification for this tree to be removed. This is a terrible loss. It was actually the loss of these 2 trees, which I was aware of and was commenting on at the time, that convinced me I've had enough. This is where I'm going to start making these. I'm going to start doing presentations. I'm going to start announcing. I'm going to start talking about this. Stick my head above the parapet and be willing to be shot down for this, because again, this is just wrong. And this is really unfortunate. One of these trees was a veteran, another one was definitely a candidate veteran. And again, I stress, it's an unfortunate set of circumstances, with every party, I'm sure, doing their best. I'm not criticising any individuals, I'm criticising the results and the recommendations that have been made because of those poor results. These are some tests of photos that I've been sent, which I had no involvement in. Now, I don't think it's fair for me to comment on situations that I don't know anything about just based on photographs. But if I was going to do that, I'd look at this one here and say, you can tell there that's an absolutely appalling tomogram, and you can see that this has been failed without any justification. There's a couple of ring shake marks and cracks in there. This is again a complete disaster. Here's another one that, again, I didn't have any direct involvement in. In this case, again, I'm not even criticising the arborists who did the work. They've been instructed to remove a tree, and coincidentally, actually, I did know this tree. I was nothing to do with this test, or didn't know anything about it. But this must have been a hell of a job to get this tree down, and the guys that did it, no doubt, did a very good job. It's just that there was absolutely no justification for that job. This tomogram is again grossly exaggerated decay. You can see that from this area here. This formation here is wrong. The decay out to the extent to the edge of the circumference there. I don't know who did the test. Again, I'm sure they've done it with the best of intentions. You can see from the remains of the stump, there's virtually no decay there. Even if this area is probably slightly degraded, but even if this area were completely hollow, there's so much sound wood around that circumference, this tree could have outlived us all. Again, absolutely no justification for that tree being removed based on the visual evidence that I can see there. And here's another one, really unfortunate. It looks like a copper beech. Again, I know nothing of this. I've got no idea who did the work, no idea who did the test, no idea who did the remove the tree. I was actually told, and I don't know if this is true, that this tree was removed on a 5-day notice. And if you look at that tomogram from what you can see there is a significant column of decay, but there's soundwood all the way around it. The tree looks perfectly healthy. This is, appalling that this has happened. I don't know why the person who did the test recommended it was removed. I don't know why, assuming the tree was protected, the tree officer allowed the tree to move, and I don't know why the arborist removed the tree. Everyone's doing their best, but this we've got to up our game. We've got to understand that residual wood around the circumference is really important. This tree could have outlived us all. Based on the evidence I can see here, there was absolutely no justification for that tree being removed. Really unfortunate situation. Here's another one. This one's slightly less unfortunate. This is a beautiful big old plane tree. Another consultant provided a test. Boom. So, where do we begin? This, you can see from that tomogram, it's a circle. The tree's not a circle. It's got too few sensors. That's not very helpful. It's got the TR ratio included in a circular form. It's got the crack detector included in it as well. This is garbage. I don't know who delivered this, but this is just uninterpretable. This tells you nothing about the tree. It just tells you there's something very wrong with that tomogram, or that this is not a very well constructed tomogram. I understand that whoever it was recommended a very heavy reduction on this tree, not removal, for whatever reasons. Fortunately, this is one that I was asked to do a second opinion on, and I'll just quickly rattle through again just to show you. This is a good tomogram. You can see a column of decay because it was contentious. It had already been recommended for removal. I tested it a bit more, did a bit more work because you want to be convincing your client that you're absolutely sure of what your findings are. So I tested that tree all over the place and found there's a column of decay with loads of sandwood around it. My recommendation was to do nothing, and thankfully the tree's still there. This is another absolutely appalling situation. Massive 30-meter plane tree, absolutely lovely, big cavity at the base. Some idiot set fire to it. The tree officer was not around at the time it happened, so others in the local authority took charge of the situation and panicked to some extent, but you can't blame them. And they arranged for a sonic tomography test, which, to be fair, probably wasn't needed, but understandable. Somebody went in and tested the tree. And this is the result. Now, I'm not going to go on about it. You can see there's a number of things that are wrong with that result. It's a circular test. It's not very good. To their credit, this consultant also drilled the tree around the circumference. You can't really tell where they drilled it because it's represented on a circular tomogram and it's not a circle. So to their credit, they did that, and that's good. And also to their credit, they knew that this was a really poor tomogram and it wasn't reliable. I can't make any judgments about why they still provided the report using that data. Maybe they didn't have the calipers with you, but you can adjust the tomogram manually anyway. You can set it up. It takes longer and you have to be really careful, but you don't need the calipers to do an accurate anyway, whatever the reason, that's what they provided. They didn't recommend felling the tree. and they did recommend a heavy reduction. Now, I suppose if you're in a position where you've got these results, and even if you know they're not reliable, it'd be a bold man that's going to say, okay, let's just walk away, it's fine. Maybe it would have been appropriate to recommend further testing. Whatever the situation, I don't know. I'm not going to speculate on that. But they recommended a heavy reduction. Unfortunately, because of where the tree was and the whole area being cordoned off since the fire took place, and the fact that there were power lines underneath, and the road underneath had been closed, and the car park had been closed, and so on and so on, it became a bit of a political situation as well. The council thought, well, if we're going to reduce this tree, and then have to reduce it again in a few years. And to reduce the tree, we're going to have to get all the power switched off, and it's going to be really expensive. They came to the understandable conclusion that, probably it's better just to remove the tree. Now, I understand that an appointment was made with the electrical company to begin the process of arranging a shutdown of the electricity and to get the tree taken down. But thankfully, to the tenacity and the electric company didn't turn up for the appointment, and the tenacity and the wherewithal of the tree officer, outstanding tree officer, who contacted me about this, and I managed to move things around and go and test the tree myself while it was in limbo, and that was my result. And I found that obviously there's a great deal more sandwood, and you can see there's a bit of a difference between the two tomograms, and it explains again the importance of getting these things right and not basically not using circular tomograms, for example. So again, because of the contentious situation, I tested the hell out of it, scienced the hell out of this tree to make sure that my results could be very clearly understood. I drilled it in various places. You can see there's lots of sounding wood there. There's some columns along the front of the tree which aren't connected at the height of the tomogram, so they don't appear in the tomogram, but they are connected above and below that, so they do have some support. And I tested those as well, and thankfully, largely thanks to the tree officers, absolute unwillingness to give in, and full credit to the local authority who once they'd got my report, backtracked on the whole situation. They decided not to fell the tree, and it remains there to this day. My recommendation was to fill the hole with wood chip, which is a fantastic tried and true method from Jim Curry, a good old friend of mine, who did it with a veteran tree which had been set on fire 10 years ago at Weald Country Park, which is an absolutely fabulous tree that's still there. And so I learned from his suggestion and recommended the same thing. And I also recommended a climbed inspection because, there was some decay in the crown, some inner notice in the crown, that kind of thing, which I wasn't able to properly. But that's it, basically. Climbed inspection, leave the tree alone. And thankfully, the tree still remains. That's really, really fortunate. So the key point to remember is decay detection is just a tool in the box. You've got to do it correctly. This is the the next screen's got my QR code if anyone's interested. So this is the document that Paul and Ian and I produced, which gives a load of interesting and objectively reasonable questions that you might ask if you're presented with a tomogram that you don't fully understand. This is freely available. John, I think you're willing to hand this out. It's been on LinkedIn a bit. Anyone can have this. It's totally free. It's just all it is simple questions that you can have. John, thank you, John. So, John, if anyone wants this, we'll hand this out. It's completely free, and so there you go. It's useful. What the point of this is for if you're a tree officer or another tree manager that you receive a decay detection report that says this is what this means, you need to do this. If the report isn't fully detailed enough, you can use this to ask the questions you might need to ask, because if you're not experienced in these tests, then you won't know what to ask. These are the questions. And that's it. There you go. So again, if you've been affected by any of the information here, please feel free to give me a shout. It's about sharing information. It's really important that we do that. And thank you very much for your attention.
Woo! And breathe, Jim. I've never had so much information in such a short space of time. That was absolutely marvellous.
Brilliant. Good.
And viewers, if you want to watch that at normal speed, it'll take you 4 hours, but you'll be able to adjust it on YouTube when you watch it back. There'll be some kind of switch for that. Fantastic. Thank you so much. We've got a few questions. We're not going to be able to go through that many questions, but as I said in the chat, we'll be sending all of the chat and all of the questions to both of our speakers, and they'll be able to have a little look. And the document that Jim mentioned, we're going to send out automatically to anyone who asks for a CPD certificate, and then we can share it with anyone else as well. One point I would just say, in the sort of interests of balance, I guess, there's been a bit of conversation in the chat, particularly around Russell's presentation. I would just agree with some of what's been said in terms of the complexity that there is in some of these cases. And the fact that they can't always be summarised. There is more detail, and obviously the people really in the know there or involved with it have maybe seen a different perspective. But obviously Russell's perspective is incredibly valuable, and I very much appreciate it. But there are lots of different sides to it. So I thought I'd say that for balance, because we're like the BBC, kind of. So, a couple of questions. Right, some general ones. You can each answer, but we'll try and make them a little bit snappy. Giovanna's asked, why are tree departments so risk averse? We're losing so many healthy trees where Giovanna lives, and it's very frustrating. I think I know the answer, but either of you, why are these councils risk averse?
Well, I think it's very, very hard for tree officers. You know, you basically you got a limited budget, you've got a limited number of staff, a limited opportunity to go, opportunities to get extra detailed surveys done. I mean, I don't know how many local authorities regularly get PICUS or resistograph analysis done, because it costs a lot of money. And there is a risk-averse culture. And, you know, every case that goes through makes it harder. We've got to be much more realistic about what risk really means. And you can't blame the tree officer if there are ARB consultants getting it wrong in court. That's my view.
That's true, and it's also the litigious society that we live in, and the potential for, you know, claims against people if they get it wrong and all this kind of thing. It's a very unfortunate situation, and so I think that changing that is going to be a gradual process. But it's by, you know, us in our profession. I don't mean us here. I mean all of us in our profession, talking about this and increasing knowledge and understanding as the best we can, so that we can. There's so many unknowns, and the default seems to be, well, if in doubt, have it out, and that's what we need to move away from. We should be saying, no, let's understand as much as we can understand, and make our decisions based on what we know rather than that unknown factor.
Absolutely. And of course, you know, I bang on about tree officers all the time, but I haven't been a tree officer for myself for a while. It's a very different perspective when you're responsible for the tree, and when if something goes wrong with that tree, it's on you, and it's you know, they've got a hard enough job as it is without necessarily leading themselves. So, kind of on the same sort of lines, but Giovanna as well, actually. Well done, another good question. And John have asked the same question, really, which is, what can we do to stop losing trees through subsidence claims in the insurance industry? John's asking, is there any hope we can get a change in the law to protect our trees from subsidence claims?
I doubt it. I'm with my cynical side. I mean, given the.
I don't know, Jim. I'm a little. Sorry, Jim.
No, go on. No, I'm waiting for you. Go on, Russell. Sorry.
Well, I'm a little bit more optimistic. I do think we can get a change in the law. I mean, I did have a chat with Charles Miners at the ARB conference, and he didn't kind of concur with my view. But there is an argument for bringing much more public policy, public benefit of trees into some of these private law subsidence claims. It's not going to be easy, but basically, if you can find the right tree, a significant tree, which is causing subsidence, and then you take it to court and basically say, well, yeah, okay, so it's causing subsidence, but there's another way to fix the subsidence. There's not another way to, you know, keep this magnificent tree. And I think it is a question of balance. You know, there are probably some relatively lower quality trees that may inevitably be lost to subsidence claims because of the difficulties of remedying poor structural. We could change the law on subsidence, but it will take the right team to take the right case. And law often goes wrong because either the solicitor or the barrister or the expert doesn't understand what they're doing. So it could be done, but right tree, right case.
Thank you very much. Jim, you've given me a new favourite phrase tonight. You've been sciencing the hell out of trees all night. And one little bit of science that I'm curious about, and about half a dozen people have asked as well, what does wood chip do in a burnt out tree cavity?
Well, the principle was it's not the wood chip itself; it's the fact that it's quite difficult to light wood chip in that closed area, and of course, filling the cavity means there's less oxygen in there, and of course, and if you also use a little bit of something like chicken wire to close, effectively you're filling in that space, so depriving it of oxygen, and you might think wood chip's not easy to just set light to, particularly not in that situation unless you're
God knows we've
accelerating
tried, Jim.
somewhere. Yeah, exactly.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Okay. So, Russell, question for you. Mirko's asked about the sort of sometimes arbitrary time frame recommendations for tree care measures. Mirko's saying it's basically using a glass ball to predict failure. You say you must prune the tree in the next 2 weeks or in the next 6 months or whatever it is. When they're so arbitrary, how can we really get our clients to sort of almost believe what we're saying?
I think this is a significant issue. Is like, where do you admit the arbitrariness or the kind of the weakness in your expertise, and when do you kind of bluff it a bit because you want someone to do what you want them to do? I think the thing is about being more open, about saying, this is my professional opinion. I think we should do X, and being open to pushback in a discussion. But the truth is, if it's your name that's on the report, if it's your name that's on the line, you've got to push for what you think is right. And if a client or anyone else wants to go against it, then you just say, "Well, I thought we should have done X." But I mean, this is the problem of managing urban trees. It's very, very tricky. I think the only thing you can do is just keep learning, so that that even within the parameters of uncertainty, you're getting a good guess.
We tend to move away from using timeframes as well. For example, tree risk assessments like QTRA and Valid are really good because they use a traffic light system. So you're not actually trying to put an arbitrary time frame on a recommendation to deal with an urgent problem, for example. You just say, look, this is urgent, this is less urgent, this is less urgent. And so also the problem with putting timeframes on as well, if you deal with a large tree population for a tree owner or a council, for example, a local authority, and they have a load of works that have all got to be completed within a month, they may not be able to get them all done within a month. And then that leaves them with that liability of works which are out of date or overdue, which is not really a good situation to be in. But if you've got works that are categorized by a traffic light system, then you can at least demonstrate that you're working to deal with all your urgent jobs first, and so you're not tied in by that time frame. And I think that's a really important consideration.
Brilliant. Thank you both. Good question from Peter here, aimed at Jim. How long did you use a Picus until you were reasonably confident in your results? You've been really open about the fact that you're still learning, but how long did it take you until you kind of felt I sort of know what I'm doing here?
I don't know if I do know what I'm doing. No, I don't know. It's difficult to put a time frame on it, but I mean, the thing is, here's a key problem. There isn't any training in using sonic tomographs. You get training in setting it up when you buy the equipment from your supplier, and that's very helpful. To be fair, it doesn't take very long to learn how to set up a test, but it's only through experience and coming across different results that you're going to learn about how they appear and how to understand them. And that's something I should have mentioned earlier. Actually, the Baum Static Group, who have developed a standard for static load testing. I've been very privileged to be invited into that. There's now a sonic tomography group, which will be working to build a standard for sonic tomography, because there is no training on this. But I mean, as I say, beyond the actual setting up of a test, there's no interpretation. There's no one that teaches you how to interpret these results, and that's why communicating with others is really useful. Because if we can drop those barriers and start talking about the results we've got and say, look, I don't know what this means. What do you think? We should be able to do that, and that's exactly what I did in the past. And it was, as I mentioned, people like John Haraway and both my friends Ian and Paul, who we are similarly minded and like to share and talk about these things. And I think that's really the only way until there is a standard, and that's some time away. But I think it's really important. And again, that's why it's so important that I reiterate that I'm not criticizing the individuals who created those tomograms, which were really poor tomograms, and it's not their fault. I'm not blaming them. They probably didn't understand that it was that bad. Otherwise, they wouldn't have presented it. But it's a difficult situation to be in because there is nowhere to go for this training. So I think sharing of information is the key here, at least until there is some sort of standard. And why not continue with that?
Brilliant, thanks, Jimmy. There were a couple of questions along those lines, actually. Emma, for example, was asking if there's more stringent rules required for training and use of tomographs. And we've talked a little bit, haven't we, about possibly doing some kind of training. I'm not going to commit in front of more than 600 people because we've got a big pipeline of things we want to do, but it's certainly something that's needed.
Well, something I'd be very keen to be involved in, and I know Ian and Paul would, and I'm sure there are others. I'm sure that I think I spoke to Jason Hasaka a while ago, and he would be very interested as well. I'd be keen to get him involved. And there are others there are plenty of people out there who do this work very well. And let's I don't know how we're going to do it, but let's share information. Let's put something together. Let's raise the game for everybody. Let's put that information out there so that we're all doing it well. That's what we want to do. All of us want to do our jobs to the best of our ability, and where that means tree officers interpreting results that they receive, to consultants who are doing the tests, to tree surgeons and arborists who are given a report and told to go and fell the tree. They should be able to look and say, hang on a minute, that doesn't look right. Are you sure this tree needs to be felled? We all got to do it. Otherwise, we're going to see lots more disastrous and unnecessary tree removals. Let's up our game as a profession.
Let's science the hell out of those trees.
Yeah, you got it. Exactly.
Okay, thank you both so much. There's one final question, of course, and it's just flown by. We're almost at 8 o'clock. So I think it was Aaron who said, just go on till 8 o'clock. We have done, Aaron, just for you. Just for you. So let's go to Russell first. Russell, what is your favourite tree-related book?
Okay, so obviously there are a few, but the one for the moment is Andrew Heron's Applied Tree Biology book, because if you want to understand trees in detail, you need to understand a lot more about tree physiology. And this is one of the books that kind of does that. We need to do a lot more studying. And so I'm really glad that book is out there, and I haven't got through it yet. But Applied Tree Biology.
Brilliant. Good choice. There's a copy on the bookshelf behind me, available at the Arboricultural Association bookshop. I'm sure other retailers are available, but why would you want to bother with anyone else? Thank you, Russell. Jim, what is your selection?
Well, you can see behind, I've got the Tree Time wonderful book, Ted Green's wonderful book, and the route identification book. Beautiful, wonderful book. I noticed that Jeremy Barrell mentioned David Lonsdale's number 7, my well-thumbed copy. That's a fantastic book. And of course, the veteran management book, which builds on Helen Reed's fantastic work as well. Alios Farron's Ancient Oaks, one of my big things. I'm generally working my way through visiting all the oak trees in there. But for one that I think may not have been mentioned so far is the one I'm currently reading, which is How to Read a Tree by what's his name? Sorry, Tristan Gooley. And this is a really interesting book. It's written from, he's clearly a very well educated naturalist, and has really some fascinating insights. Basically, he's talks about what he's seen. Basically, it's very interesting because it looks upon things that many of us will have looked upon without actually seeing. So it's got some really interesting perspectives, and I think it's good for ARBs and good for non-ARBs. It's a really interesting tree book. So How to Read a Tree.
Great choice, thank you. And one we haven't had before. I'd love to find out if he's a naturist or a naturalist, because they're quite different things.
Yeah. I thought I might have made a bit of a faux pas there.
You can do both, but for legal reasons, I just wanted to make clear that the Arboricultural Association is not accusing Tristan Gooley of being a naturist, even though with a name like Gooley's, perhaps he should.
Who knows? I haven't finished the book yet. Maybe he describes in more detail.
Just an amazing twist at the end. Just a picture. Anyway, right. Yeah. Okay, Jim, Russell, thank you so much. That was absolutely brilliant. Really, really great stuff. We said at the beginning about numbers and how many people watch, and you said it was more important how many people were at the end than at the beginning. And we had more than 700 people up until about 15 minutes ago. So that's a pretty big
Thank you.
deal. So well done, both of you. Thank you, all of you, for watching. Thank you, Steel, of course, for sponsoring. We've got the webinar next week. Please join us for lime trees and wild streets. And then the following week, we've got Levan Bigelow, as I said, which is going to be brilliant as well. So please sign up for those. Thank you to our speakers. Thank you to all of you. Have a lovely evening and see you next week. Goodbye.